I have another example set up here that we can dig through. There's also been a recent update to the base project, and it now contains another file. This file is called params.php. This is a file that we've had around for a long time that I've continually been updating, and its purpose is basically to look through all of the parameters that came in with a request, all of the data that came in from a request, and to show it to you. It prints it out in the body of the form. I've updated this to use Bootstrap and to use some Bootstrap tabs. It's kind of a fun little page to dig through and learn. You don't have to understand everything that's happening here, but I did try and be fairly liberal with the comments to explain what's going on. So I do encourage you to look through it and just make sure you understand it all, even if you don't think you could have written it yourself. It does get a little bit sophisticated in some places, but by and large, this is all stuff that at least should make sense what it's doing. And if it doesn't, please ask questions. What is this actually going to do? It is going to look at the content of all of those different arrays: request, post, get, and cookie. And it's going to print them all for you in tabs. If you'd like to access it, all you have to do is after you run grunt to start it up, just put /params.php, and that will load that specific file. Here's what comes up for me. You may or may not see this. You'll see there is actually one value. Where did that come from? So initially it shows you everything that was inside the request array. Let's go to post. Okay, post doesn't have anything in it, and we'd expect that. We didn't actually send it a post thing. We just pulled it up on a URL, and that's always a GET request. What about GET? No data from GET. And in fact, we know that because otherwise we'd see it up here in the URL. So it has to be in cookie. And there it is. There is a cookie planted for this. And I'm suspicious that what it actually is it's coming from the browser sync process that's going on here. Browser sync probably needs to store a cookie or something like that. But you'll notice cookies just kind of show up unexpectedly all over the place. We'll talk more about cookies and what they are and how you can use them at another time. So let's go ahead and come on back here and let's see if we can actually put some information in here that's useful. At this point, I'm just going to do it all right here in the browser. So let's just make this bigger so we can see what we're doing and type away. So the first type of request is the GET request. The GET request should just ask for something, and it doesn't have a body, or at least it never should. Anything you put in the body is going to be ignored by the server if the server is behaving properly. Instead, information gets put into the URL, and you do it through what we would call URL encoding. URL encoding is going to encode some of those special characters, but also has a typical format where we have question mark, key equals value, like this. And key can be anything you want. I'm sorry, this is probably a little small here. Hopefully you can see it in the HD version. But key can be anything you want. Value can also be anything you want. They are strings that are used to identify this, and value is pretty much always going to come in as a string, even if it's an integer or something. It comes in more generically as a string, and you can convert it to an integer later. Let's go ahead and send this request. So that gets encoded. The URL is going to look like this. The body will be empty. And here's what it actually shows then. Inside of the request array, we have one single value with the word key as its key. And what's its value? Well, it's value. Let's make this something a little bit more interesting. Let's call this greeting, and we'll say that the greeting is aloha. There we go. So it says inside of the array request, we have a key greeting, and greeting is aloha. That's the value that was given to those. We can go through here a little bit too. Let's confirm where it's coming from. This should be in the GET array because it was in the URL, and anything that's in the URL shows up in there. Post, okay, post is empty, that's expected. Get is not, it has greeting on it, aloha. And then we still got the one little value in cookie data that I don't know where it came from. Actually, I do. That's part of the sockets.io library, which is something that Browser Sync uses. That's what that is. I should have remembered. But anyways, let's keep going here. We don't have to just supply one. You can separate your key value pairs with an ampersand. So I say and, let's say, departure equals, well, in this case, it would also equal aloha, right? Because it means both hello and goodbye. There we go. Let's change these around. We could say this is hello, and this is goodbye. And there we go. And you could keep doing this. let's say we want a title, and we'll say it's doctor, and then we'll say we want a name, we'll call it surname, equals barrier. And so here all those are coming in. Now I'm very carefully avoiding any special characters over here, like the period that would go on doctor, or spaces, or anything else, because normally those would have to be URL encoded, and that's not something you can really do by hand. I mean, you can, but I don't want to go there. So we won't even get into that. But you can put special characters up there if you first process them so that they are encoded in a special sort of format. You can also specify other useful things like arrays. So let's say we have an array that can contain different types. We would type it out generally like we would normally type an array. Type of 0 should equal, let's say, letter. And type of 1 should equal number. And type of 2 should equal symbol. Let's do that. And there we go. You can see how they're coming through here. When I pull out the type parameter, I can go into its first element in the array, and its value is letter. And similarly, the second one, which is 1, is number. Oh, and then I mistyped it here. T-Y-P-E is symbol. Letter, number, symbol. So those all come through exactly like we'd expect. Now it's worth noting, these do not have to be numbers, and generally it's not helpful for them to be numbers. You'll see as we work with other situations that different things get put here, but we could have, say, A, 1, and what's a good symbol? Plus. Oh, and plus kind of got messed up here though, didn't it? I guess I'm not surprised by that. Plus itself is probably one of those special symbols. Let's see if I can find a symbol that would be allowed. There we go, that one works. The double quotes here. It probably still needs to be URL encoded for it to work right, but at the very least Chrome is happy with it. And so then quote, there's a symbol. I'm not encouraging putting quotes in your keys. That's probably a really bad idea, but it works, just to demonstrate what's going on here. So all of this is coming through the get array. And that's really all we can do when we're playing with it in the browser here, because everything you send up here just by typing in a URL and sending it is always sent as a get request, because that's what the browser assumes you want to do when you type in a URL. You are requesting something. You want to get some information. The particular page you're getting can use the information up here to customize this, but it should never store this information in any way on the server. It just customizes its response, like I'm doing here. I generate the page a little differently, and shows you the result. And that's all there is to it. To go any further and see data in the post array, we're going to have to actually change what the page does. We're going to have to create a page that actually does post some data. So this is something that has to be initiated from the server side. Anything we do with a web browser is always going to show up as a GET request, unless we have some kind of special extension that can do different things inside our web browser. It has to be initiated from a web page. So I've got index.html over here with this example, and what we're going to do is we're going to make a form. Form's the easiest way to be able to control the actual nature of the request. It's part of the form itself. So we start out with the form tag. Hopefully you didn't forget about that. And we have to always specify two things with a form tag if we want it to work right. Here we would say method equals, and we have two general options. It's even suggesting them to you, either get or post. Let's start with get, just so that we see that it still works the way we expect. The other thing that you need to put in here is action. Action tells it where it's going to be sent. It's typically going to look like a URL. And in our case, we want it to be sent to this page over here, the params page. So we're going to call it params.php. That page is obviously a PHP page. So there we go. This is now something that when we submit this form, it's going to try and create a GET request with the data encoded in the URL, and it's going to send it to params.php. Now it's expected that the browser will take care of all those details. We'll see exactly what it does once we get this all made. But we need to create now a few things to actually turn this into a useful form. We always need a submit button, and we'll just say send form. And then let's give ourselves a few inputs. Now, of course, there's rights and wrong ways to create these. This tends to actually get pretty darn complex. We went through all of that in Unit 2. I'm not going to bother to get too careful with all of these things right here as we create them. I just want to have a quick way to examine this stuff. So let's create a text type input. We'll give it the name of, name. And we'll make it required. And then let's create another input. Let's see, the other thing we should do is give it a class of form control so that Bootstrap renders it in a decent way. Let's make a type input that is also text. Let's make its name equal to something else that we could do here. We'll do last name. So we'll do first name and last name here. Names are important. You could also give them classes that are equal to this. You'd almost certainly want to, but the classes are really only useful in JavaScript, and I'm not going to bother with JavaScript this time around. Let's also make this required, and then give it that class of form control. Or rather, I should have said, you can give it a name and an ID, of course. The element ID is useful in JavaScript, not so useful here. Let's create some other things. One of the things that is often useful here, again, we'll do input, type equals, and this time, let's do a radio type input, radio button. There is also a tag for radio buttons that you could use if you want. I believe there's also a type on the button type. There's lots of different ways to specify these. I tend to like to fall into the category where we just make them all inputs, because that's what they are at their heart. This particular one, we're not going to give it the class form control. I've found that this works best when we give it a class radio-inline. That's a Bootstrap class that helps us out here. And then it will show up over here. So you can see here we've got our two text inputs. Let's do a couple other things just to make these look right. Let me adjust this around a bit. I'm trying to not go too far with this, but there's some basics we can do. Let's give these placeholders. Placeholder equals first name. And so first name, thank you. And then this other one, let's do the same thing, only of course it's last name, is what we did. Last name. So we've got our first name and last name there. Then let's create two radio buttons here. For each of these, in order for them to actually say something, they need a label. So I'm going to say label here and put that around the input, the radio button. And I'm going to give it the label male. Obviously, I want to use these to select gender. Now, getting all of this to look correctly is a bit beyond what we want to do right here. We've already sort of delved into this a little bit, and I'll have a big example for you later on that will get us a pretty nice looking form in the end. But for right now, we're not going to worry too much about it. Lastly here, let's come down to the button and make it a little more bootstrappy. Class equals btn success. That's always a nice button. All right, I guess btn default is the one I usually do, which is that one. There we go. You can also do btn info, or primary. That's a good one, which makes it bluish. Yeah, there we go. I'm also going to put, just because we need it, a forced break in there to make these look reasonable. Now you'll notice that I haven't really put anything in here for names for these radio buttons yet, and that's deliberate. I'm doing that because I don't necessarily want them to be it's going to be complicated. There's really only one value involved here, and so we're going to have to sort of adjust the way we think about a name and a value for these. There, I like that better. Sorry, I'm talking and working at the same time here, but hopefully you can follow me. So I'm not worried about giving a name to these yet. A name is definitely going to be important, but it's just not something we want to do naively. All right, let's do one last thing here. I'm going to put a BR right here, and then we're pretty good. So we have a first name, a last name, male and female, which you'll notice aren't quite working yet, but hopefully you remember how we fixed that. I did talk about that previously. and then we have a submit button. The submit button is going to validate the form because we did put some requireds in here, but it's also going to send this data off to the action location, params.php. So let's say send form, and let's see what happened. So we told it that the type was get, and that we're sending it to params.php. And in fact, here they are. It used the name for the key value. And that's exactly why we want to specify a name also, always. And then the value was whatever they typed into it, the actual value of the input. It's the .value parameter. If we would have grabbed that out of, if we would have grabbed that using JavaScript, we would say .value, or if it was jQuery.val as a function. That's what gets sent on into it. So that's how you establish your key value pairs when you're creating a form. Let's go ahead and give this a name now. I'm going to call it gender. And you guys have already seen that usually what you want to do when you're creating radio buttons and you want them to share their place and not influence one another, and make sure, we're going to have to refresh here, make sure that only one of them can be selected, we give them the same name, gender. Why is that? Ultimately, these represent a single value that is either male or female, depending on which one is checked. And so, because of that, we want them to have the same name. The browser recognizes that and makes them mutually exclusive, so only one can be selected. And it also then will only send on one particular value. Let's see what value it does send on here. Go ahead and fill this in. We say submit form. So in this case, it just sent the value on. And that is basically saying that this particular button was on, named gender. This is a bit problematic though, because we don't know which one was on. It was previously female, now it's male. I can't quite see which one was on. So if you set them up like this, that's all you're going to get. What you need to also do is give them a value. And this is not something you do with text inputs because the value is something the user can edit. But with radio buttons, the value is predetermined. And so let's just say the value is either M or it's F, depending on which one you pick here. Please forgive my gender binary bias here. I just don't want to get into all the other options that might possibly be available here. But I'm not implying that it is a binary thing, certainly not in these days. Let's select female. Now the value is whatever value we put in here, in this case F. If you don't give it a value, it will simply be on, which means that that button was checked. And in theory, it would be off also, but if it's not checked, it just doesn't send the value at all. So off is not one you're ever really going to see. Let's come back here again, check male this time, and you'll see that now it's M. You can make those be anything you want. Note that they don't match the labels, male and M, female and F. You have complete freedom to make these values be something meaningful to you. Maybe 0 and 1 are the types of values you'd like to be able to see there. Let's come back here. Note, you'll have to refresh this page a lot because otherwise it's going to use the cached version because you were on a different page when you saved it. We send that form, now it's sending 0. So you have complete freedom to make the value be anything you want. And usually you want to think about how you're going to use it programmatically. On the other side, you're going to check it, see what it is, and then do something in the PHP code to respond to what that value was. So things like M and F are probably advisable for this particular situation. Now let's go one step further. I'm going to create one more section here. And this time, I'd like to create some checkboxes. Let's get back to our page here, and then let's save it. And so all I did was duplicate it for now, so we're still seeing gender, male, female down there. So the type you would specify if you want it to be a checkbox would be checkbox. Not too hard. Similarly, we have a checkbox inline that we can use here. I'm not entirely sure these are actually being used for anything useful, but it's good to go ahead and put them in there anyways. So checkbox inline, we'll call it. And what should this be? Let's say this is hobbies. And so we'll also change this to be hobbies. And let's throw in a few things that could be interesting. We'll say video games. What else could we have here? Home brewing. knitting, origami. Let's get a little more hip here. I'm kind of old school. Vlogging, and vining. I know Vine's dead, but yeah, let's put it in there. So there we go. For values here, let's give these things, let's say games, brewing, knitting, origami, and blog. Oh, and then we have Vine down here. There we go. Now I want all of these to be checkboxes this time. I guess I should have done a little more copy pasta before I started putting all this data in. So let's change these to checkbox. And let's change them all to be the checkbox inline. Again, I'm not really sure that's helping us, but let's be consistent. You can read about how to use these things more properly on your own, and you'll probably often find, as we did with our previous form, that you just got to get custom with your CSS when you want it to look really good. We did that with our account creation form and our login forms that we had previously. All right, there we go. So we are able to put in some stuff. Let's go ahead and type in here, Seth Barrier. I'm a dude. I do homebrewing and video games. I do origami. I do knitting. And I don't do vlogging or vining. Send form. So let's see what happened here. We've got our first name. We've got our last name. We've got our gender set to 0 here. I want to go ahead and change these to M and F for future because that's a little more descriptive. But what happened with our hobbies? It says all I do is origami. That's cool and all, but I'm a little more eclectic than that. What happened? Again, let's look at our get data. We can see this is what's coming through. The problem is that this isn't just one value anymore. When they're checkboxes, they're many values that all have a common name. We have a device for that in programming. When we have a list of data that all shares a common name, it's called an array. So if you give it one name here, the latest one simply overwrites the previous one. Brewing was in there, knitting was in there, but then origami was the last one that was set, and that just overwrote the previous two. In order to get this to work correctly, what we have to do is go in here and tell it it's an array. It's not too hard. By putting the square braces at the end of the name, we're basically informing the browser that this is an array, and I want to retain all the values. Now, if you wanted to, you could also go in here and say what the key is, if these were all going to be different keys, but most of the time, you usually just want a list of some sort. You don't really care about what their keys are, at least most of the time with how I'm doing this. That's how it's going to wind up. I will never have case to do otherwise in this class. So now let's say I just do video games and origami. Now you'll see here that video games didn't come through. Oh, because I didn't finish it. Let's fix that. 1, 2. So I just missed the top one there. So let's go ahead and try this again. Refresh. And then mail, video games, knitting this time. There we go. So now you can see it sort of automatically created a numerical array where the first value was saved as games and then the next one was added on as knitting, and we could put more in. We could send in all of these things if we wanted to. I'll leave logging out, and you can see they come in like that. Now notice the number it gets assigned to is just the number it is in the array. It just keeps adding them on numerical order. Vine, for example, was actually the 6th thing, the 6th option that could have happened here, but it's showing up in the 5th slot here. Remember, these things start at 0, so it's always one more than the number. It's showing up in the 5th slot here. Let's go over to get data so you really see how this is going. So it's just what order it is in the array. This will always be numerically ordered starting at 0, unless you actually put a value in here of some sort. But as I said before, we don't really have any reason to do that yet, so you don't necessarily need to worry about that. Now, we've been going along doing all of this with get. And you see it all coming through, how it's showing up over here. You see how we deal with basic values and then arrays as well. Arrays are generally associated with checkboxes, though you could have a select box that can have multiple selections. And again, there you'd also want to use an array. Let's take a look at what's actually been happening up here to the URL. We've been doing this all as GET requests, and you'll see here the browser is automatically encoding these into that URL encoding. And here we start to see some interesting things. Look at that. This is a array encoding right here. So URL encoding always involves a % and then some sort of hexadecimal value, which is 2 numbers or letters, one after the other. And so you'll see the array encoding that was open square brace, close square brace got encoded right there. And further on, we see other things happening here. Hobbies still gets put in there. So that's the only thing that really got URL encoded, it looked like. We didn't have any other special characters, but it did, which was important. Let's note here exactly what this could look like. We could put in actually 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And this is going to set them through slightly differently. Let's go back here. Everything's sort of checked off here. We need to refresh this. Fill it out again real quick. And let's say I just do the first and last one. You'll notice now that they actually come through as 0 and 5. And if you look up here, it's a little hard to see. Here's the 0 between the open and closed braces. And over here, here's the 5 between the open and closed braces. So that's how this is all coming together, how it's all working. And it's all right there in the URL. Now, people will tell you that this is insecure. Anybody using their browser is going to be able to see this data if they just go up there and get interested in it and start poking through the URL. It's just sitting out here raw in the URL. Another thing that's important to note is there are limits. This can only be so long before it exceeds the allowed limit, which I think is about 2,000 characters, something in that range. So that's another thing that you'll run into if you're using get excessively. Now, post is generally referred to as the more secure way of doing it because then the data is in the body of the request. You don't really see it, not in an average browser. Let's go ahead and switch this. I'm going to switch it over to be post now. All we have to do is go up to the form tag, and where we said get, we're now going to say post. We save that. Let's go back and refresh our page, and let's put some data in. Mail, that does video games and homebrewing. Send form. It still showed up, Seth, Barrier, Mail, Games, Brewing, and the URL now has nothing attached onto the end. And come over here, you can see what's going on. It's actually in the post array instead, and there's nothing in the get array. It came in as post data. PHP really shows it to us in the exact same way. Everything that we did before still applies here. The data will work the way it did before. Because we've put actual values in for these arrays, those would be used, but I'm going to go back to not having them there because I just like it to be sequential. I really don't care that they have actual indexes or anything of that nature. And the trick is that it's inside the header. Now, people will tell you that using post is more secure. But is it? In fact, it's really just passive security. The data is still there, perfectly visible by anyone that wants to look at it. Let me show you how. Here we are in the Chrome browser. Every browser will do this a little bit differently, but if you want to see this stuff, we'll go back over into Inspect. Again, this is just to bring up the developer tools. And where we want to head is to the Network tab. Now, I got into the Network tab when we were dealing with Ajax because it's really handy to see the things going back and forth in there. But this also really exposes all of the raw HTTP things that are happening. Let me go ahead and refresh the page because the Network tab will only store information as the page is loading and exchanging. So there we go. Now all of this is in there. So a lot of extra stuff. You'll see it loading the scripts, and then you'll see Browser Sync doing its thing, which always looks weird, but don't worry about it. Browser Sync is a very complicated tool. Now what we do is we take a look at the initial request, params.php. Just physically click on that, and it will bring up everything that was in that request. First of all, it gives you a preview of what the actual response looked like. That's nice and all. Let's take a look at the headers. This is where the interesting information is. So here was the general things. This was a post and the URL for that post, and then the status code that we got back. It also shows you what headers were in the response. It actually parses these out. If you want to view the source headers, just click View Source, and it shows you exactly what those look like. And our request had headers in it too. You'd probably want to take a look through these. This actually tells you what you're sending out to the server every time you do a request on this page. It says what kind of encoding it will accept. It says in here the cookies that are being sent that are associated with this page. It also tells you all the kinds of file types that it recognizes, the origin, the actual page. There's lots of information in here. Occasionally, depending on what the server asks for, it might even tell you things like what your particular URL was or your IP address. So those are our request headers. But down here is the actual body of the request. View source will show you the source itself, and it's just like I said it was. It's key value pairs that look just like they did up here in get. You can view parsed, and it shows you how it parses is out, and it also view URL encoded. You can see how it was URL encoded in order to get over there correctly. So this shows you the real raw details. It's some of what the PHP data viewer, our params.php, is showing us as well. Here, this is nice because then we can be sure it's like that in PHP. This is just what the browser interpreted from it, so that's a little less useful. So, is that any more secure? Well, you got to know what you're doing to get over and find it. It's not just sitting there in the URL, but it is not secure. So don't pretend for a moment that post is all you need to make it secure. It's not. It is absolutely a good idea, and you should use it. Passive security is security. But do not pass unencoded passwords in this way. If you are dealing with passwords, there are two key things you should be doing. Number one, you should be hashing those passwords before you send them out to the server. That way, anybody who's listening to your transfer doesn't see the actual password, just its hash. The other thing you should be doing is you should make absolutely sure you are on a secure connection before you do it. Namely, that this is an HTTPS connection. All of that is well beyond the scope of this class, but I put it out there so that you do understand that simply switching to post is not secure. Any sensitive information that you want to be sending will only be protected if you're using HTTPS, and if you're sending passwords, hash them before you send them as an extra layer of security. This is all actual security that is mathematically infeasible to break. It doesn't mean it can't be broken, but it's mathematically infeasible to do so. And so it makes your conversation more private between you and the server. With all that being said, we've seen now the basics of how we can examine the post and get data, what it looks like to pull that out over in the PHP. Again, look through params.php and maybe make sure you understand what we're doing here. We're going to actually get hands-on with this as we continue moving forward and look about validating this data before we do anything with it. Right now, we're just examining it and seeing how it all flies around and works together.